Welcome, everyone. Come on in, get a virtual seat, and we'll start in just a few moments. Well, welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last Dean's Conversation Series program of the 2020-2021 academic year. I'm very excited that today we have with us Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Mr. Rothstein is going to speak for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll reserve the rest of the time for questions. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, and I'll come back on once the prepared remarks are completed, and we'll have a discussion using your questions. Mr. Rothstein, thank you for being with us. I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Dickerson, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation this afternoon. I guess it's evening by now, even in Chicago. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. We began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then in colleges and universities. And then, as you know, in 1954, civil rights lawyers persuaded the Supreme Court to ban legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision then inspired a movement of activists who engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. So people lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, really, the civil rights movement had persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, shared by most Americans at the time, not all, but most, we abolished segregation in public accommodations, in public transportation, in much employment. And then in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, we passed a fair housing law that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all African American or mostly African American. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with a democratic society, how could we leave untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly it's because it's hard to do anything about it. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation in public accommodations, the next day you go to any restaurant you want and sit anywhere you want in that restaurant. If we pass a law abolishing segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, easterners, westerners, even midwesterners, is adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to confront this biggest segregation of all. And the excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of schools and colleges and public accommodations and public transportation, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a civil rights violation that we as American citizens had an obligation to redress. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, also a civil rights violation that we have an obligation to redress. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally, by accident. It happened because bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or because actors in the private economy, banks, realtors, developers, insurance companies, discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because people just like to live with each other, the same race. We feel more comfortable that way, and we choose neighborhoods homogenous race like our own. Or maybe we say it's economic. Africa, many African Americans can't afford to move to many white neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but non-governmental private sector actions, self-choice, self-selection, and economic trends is what's created residential segregation. We give us a name to this rationalization. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government, but just in the private sector. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Most of us, if we think about it, thinks it's too bad. We don't like living in an apartheid society. But as I say, we have we accept no obligation to do anything about it. Well, I spent most of my career before I started writing this book, The Color of Law, writing about education policy. That was my area of expertise. I knew very little about housing. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent a lot of time criticizing the dominant educational theory of the country at that time. This was a broadly shared theory across the political spectrum. It went like this. It said we have an achievement gap between Black and white children. Black children achieve at lower levels in school than white children do on average. And the reason we have an achievement gap is because teachers don't try very hard to teach Black children. They have low expectations of them. And if only we could force teachers, force schools to try harder, to work harder, to teach African American children, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but it was enacted into law in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act, supported by Democrats and Republicans, broadly supported. The law said that from now on, we're going to have to test children every year and hold schools and teachers accountable for their test scores. And the law said that if we do that, in the end of 7 years, the achievement gap will disappear. It was, as I say, ludicrous. It's now 20 years out. The achievement gap is still pretty much where it was in 2000 when this law was passed. All the No Child Left Behind law accomplished was it gave schools teaching disadvantaged children an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and devote inordinate time to drilling children in math and reading in a hopeless effort to raise their test scores to the level of middle-class children. It's not that there aren't some teachers with low expectations who don't try very hard to teach African American children, but that's not the main reason we have an achievement gap. The main reason we have an achievement gap in schools is because so many African American children from low-income neighborhoods come to school with social and economic disadvantages that impede their ability to take advantage of what even the best schools have to offer. For example, I remember writing one column. I was the New York Times education columnist for a while, and I wrote one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in cities like Chicago have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more polluting industries nearby, more trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't, not in every case, but more likely, to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And this is a simple statistical proposition that if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, same racial composition, same social economic background, same family structure, but one group has a slightly higher rate of asthma than the other, that group with the higher rate of asthma is going to have lower average achievement simply because more children will be drowsy in school. Well, it doesn't make a big difference. But then you begin to think of all of the other conditions that the children, African American children in particular, from low-income neighborhoods come to school with that challenge their ability to learn, whether it's asthma
or lead poisoning that has a measurable impact on IQ, or maybe homelessness or other forms of economic insecurity. Uh, Once you add these all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. It leaves a little bit of explanation for low teacher expectations, but not much. Well, I was writing and thinking about these issues, and I soon realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well nourished, well rested, from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you enact requiring it. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation was a school issue, an education policy issue. That's how I came to the investigation that led to this book, The Color of Law. This is what I was thinking about. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. That decision involved two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts, as you may know if you've studied this case, had very, very token school desegregation programs. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if a parent chose a school that where their choice would intensify segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent whose child wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, black child would be given some preference. Very trivial program. But the Supreme Court rejected it. The decision was a controlling decision, opinion. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained, he said, yes, it's true that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he explained that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated de facto, not by government action, but by private bigotry and actions in the private economy and self-choice and economic differences. And he said, where you have de facto segregation, something that the government did not create, the Constitution prohibits the government from taking explicit action to redress it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened in one of those two cities, Louisville, Kentucky, some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of single-family homes called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in that suburb and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that either. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, all agents of the state are committing a 14th Amendment violation by enforcing racial boundaries in the county of Louisville. And I began to look into it further, and I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases, not just in border states like Kentucky, but in Chicago in particular, in Detroit, in New York, in Boston, and Baltimore, and Denver, and Kansas City, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Cases of police protected, frequently police organized and led mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these where the police was involved in either protecting, organizing, or leading the violence was a civil rights violation, a 14th Amendment violation, that we have an obligation as Americans to redress, an obligation we've never accepted. And I began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. I don't have time to go into many of them. I describe many of them in the book, The Color of Law, but let me just describe a couple of them to you this afternoon. One, perhaps one of the more powerful ones, was a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white working class, middle class population that was then living in urban areas, to suburbanize them into single family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans would be excluded. This was a racially explicit program of the federal government. I should say that at the time, we had many, many integrated downtown areas. Not every downtown area was integrated, but we had many of them in this country. We'd be stunned if we were somehow transported back to see the extent of non-segregation that existed, for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. And so the workers who worked in those factories or in the service industries that supported them, black and white, had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods to be able to walk to work or take short streetcar rides. The federal government determined to move the whites in those non-segregated communities, as well as in segregated ones in urban areas, to single-family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans would be excluded. You know these suburbs, they're all over the country. Every metropolitan area in the country has them to create a white noose around these metropolitan areas. Perhaps the most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the developer, William Levitt, the funds to buy the land and build 17,000 homes east of New York City. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. Remember, we weren't a suburban country at that time. They didn't think anybody would want to move to these places. The only way that Levitt could build his development, and the same thing is true of developments in Chicago and everywhere else in the country, the only way they could build them was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, the construction materials they were going to use, and a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required these developers, like Levitt, to include a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. It's a racially explicit policy. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA and VA. This was written federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration issued an underwriting manual to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders who wanted to get federally guaranteed bank loans to build their suburban subdivisions. The manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project that was going to include African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project that was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. The white noose around every metropolitan area was created in large part by this federal policy. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer in Detroit area was required to construct by the Federal Housing Administration to separate his project from a nearby African-American neighborhood as a condition of getting a federal bank guarantee for his loans to build the project. Well, the white families who moved to these suburbs with federal subsidies, these were not wealthy people. They were working class families, had jobs in the post-war economy. The homes at the time sold for $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's about $100,000. Over time, those suburbs gained in value. As I think you all know, you can no longer buy a suburban single-family home for $100,000. Those homes now sell, depending on the part of the country, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes saw the value of their property appreciate. They gained wealth from that appreciation, equity in the value of their homes. They used that wealth, that equity, to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, temporary unemployment maybe, or a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, on average, African American family incomes are about 60% of white family incomes. You'd think that African American wealth would also, on average, be about 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American family incomes are 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is only 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that every one of us as Americans has an obligation to remedy, an obligation we have never assumed. Well, that wealth gap that is the result today of those unconstitutional policies practiced in the mid-20th century, that wealth gap determines, to a large extent, the racial inequality that we have today, and that is ongoing. I mentioned earlier the achievement gap in schools that results in large part from the fact that African Americans have no down payments to move out of lower income neighborhoods into higher opportunity places, and the resulting, as a result, concentrates the most disadvantaged and challenged children in single neighborhoods and in single schools. For the same reason, the wealth gap predicts health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, places without access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. The wealth gap predicts also mass incarceration of young African American men and the abuse by police that we spent so much time demonstrating about in Black Lives Matter demonstrations last year. I'm not suggesting that no police officers would ever abuse African Americans were it not for the concentration of young men in single neighborhoods of disadvantage. That's a large part result of the wealth gap that we created. But the discrimination against these young men by police is much, much more intense and greater because they're concentrated in single places. When young men, large numbers of them, are concentrated in areas without access to good jobs or transportation to get them, or schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their students, the police inevitably engage in confrontations with them and develop tactics that are characteristic of any occupying force. The British in in India, the Belgians in the Congo, they are assigned the responsibility of keeping under control a disaffected restive population. And that's the way police operate in concentrated ghettos in this country. The wealth gap also predicts something else, which is, I think, very, very frightening and dangerous. I imagine most of you agree with me about this, and that is the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? that we have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences. That's another consequence of the unconstitutional policy of segregation that the federal government followed with this one wealth generating program. Well, there were many, many other programs, unconstitutional, of federal, state, and local governments. I'll mention one other that I think I have time to squeeze in. Maybe I'll talk about public housing, something that we're all familiar with and we misunderstand. We think public housing, I'm sure most of us think of public housing as a place where poor people live. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began during the Depression and the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. We had a 25% unemployment rate at that time, but public housing was not for the poor, not for the unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had stable income, stable jobs, who could pay the full cost of housing in their rent, not subsidized. The federal government built this housing because we had a housing crisis. The private sector wasn't building housing at the time, and working middle-class families couldn't find housing. The federal government built the first public housing projects across the country in Chicago and elsewhere, and everywhere it built public housing, it segregated it, frequently segregating those non-segregated neighborhoods that I described earlier for the first time. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography, The Big C, perhaps some of you have mentioned it, how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said in high school, his best friend was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that with other public housing projects elsewhere in Cleveland, also segregated, created a pattern of segregation that exists still to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, I like, where I can, to describe self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than the rest of us. One I describe is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Perhaps you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half white and half black. But the Public Works Administration and other federal agencies went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation there where it hadn't previously existed. The West Coast was similarly segregated by the federal government. As you may know, the mass migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states to places like Chicago and Pittsburgh and Detroit, other so-called Rust Belt cities that took place during World War I did not extend to the West Coast. The first mass migration of African Americans to the West Coast took place during World War II, when hundreds of thousands of black and white workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war plants that hadn't existed during the Depression. They overwhelmed the places where they migrated to take these jobs. There was no housing for them. If the government wanted, the ships and the planes, two primary products of war manufacture on the West Coast, if it wanted them to be produced, it had to provide housing for these workers, and it did. It provided segregated housing for workers who were working in the same war plants. In San Francisco, for example, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers. 4 were for African American. I'm sorry, 4 were for whites. For whites only, African Americans prohibited from living in them. 1 was for African Americans only, located in a district that then became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. Across the bay, in another one of those smug places, Berkeley, California, it's just south of the Kaiser shipyards in a town called Richmond. In Berkeley, the federal government built housing for white shipyard workers along the shopping area and near the residential area of Berkeley. For African American shipyard workers, it built housing along the railroad tracks and then the industrial area, segregating them with a pattern of segregation that exists as it does in San Francisco to this date. There were many, many other policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to ensure that we be a segregated society. The policies to redress this segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Think tanks, policy experts, journalists write about good ideas all the time to redress segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to create the political environment where those good policy ideas become inevitable. I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders now to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation. We will be hiring organizers to create local committees of civil rights activists to take action to redress segregation. I can give you some examples of some of the policies that we should be following, these well-known policies, if we had the political environment to do so. I mentioned before the suburbs created by the federal government for whites only, that at the time were affordable to both Black and white workers at $100,000, and today are unaffordable to working class families of either race, unless they happen to have down payments that they've inherited from their parents and grandparents. Well, what's a narrowly targeted remedy for that very specific constitutional violation? What would an affirmative action program in housing look like? You're all lawyers. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think the federal government should be buying up homes in these suburbs at market rates and reselling them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans as a remedy for this very specific constitutional violation. Local civil rights groups should also be pressing the banks and the realtors, the developers who created these segregated white neighborhoods for contributions to voluntary reparations funds that provide additional assistance to African Americans to access neighborhoods from which they were excluded and still are excluded economically, from which they were excluded unconstitutionally in the mid-20th century. I did write a column about how this would work a few months ago. I'll share that with you after this session is over. At the low end of the economic scale, the federal government has some programs to subsidize the housing of low-income families. One of them is the low-income housing tax credit. It's a subsidy given by the Treasury Department to low-income housing developers. The Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing those low-income housing credit units, housing tax credit units, in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be placing some of those units in those neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing, but to place a priority on segregation rather than creating more opportunities for some of those units to be placed in higher opportunity communities, the policy is backwards and reinforces segregation. The same thing is true of another program I think you've probably heard of, the Section 8 voucher program that subsidizes the rents of lower income families so that they can afford to rent apartments at the median rent in the metropolitan area. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you're creating a subsidy at the median rent, it's going to be too low to rent an apartment in the higher opportunity places. And it's actually too high to rent an apartment in low income segregated neighborhoods where landlords exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. There are a few communities that have adjusted their Section 8 voucher amounts so that they're higher for opportunities for families who choose to move to places where there are greater opportunities, and lower for families who choose to move, lower but still adequate for families who choose to move to segregated neighborhoods. Well, unless we have, as I say, a civil rights movement that is going to make it uncomfortable to maintain these present patterns of segregation, these easily accessible policies will not be implemented. I'm hopeful that we will see such a movement. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion today about race and racial inequality than we ever have had before in American history. We had 20 million Americans participating in Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer and spring. We have white elected politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. Unheard of, inconceivable just a few years ago. This kind of awareness is essential, and out of it, a movement of activists can grow. One of the first things that a movement of activists would do, or should do, in any community is ensure that their schools are teaching the history that I just described to you accurately. As you may know, if you've looked at The Color of Law, I have a section in that book where I analyze the textbooks commonly used in American history courses, at least at the time I wrote this book about 5 years ago, that were commonly used in American history courses in schools across the country. And I concluded and showed that every one of them lies about this history. The new movement to redress racial segregation will have curricular materials that local groups can use to demand that their school districts adopt, that their local schools adopt, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they'll be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. With that, I'm going to conclude. I think we have time now for about 20 minutes of questions, and I look forward to engaging in this discussion with you.
Great, thank you. We've had several questions come in. The first one is, how do you engage with the opposition to the policies you discuss? How do you get their buy-in? And do you think we even need to get their buy-in?
Well, that's the purpose of a civil rights movement, is to engage in this kind of education in their communities and develop a broader base of support. Let me say that the history that I described to you this afternoon and in the book, The Color of Law, is incontrovertible. I'm not a professional historian. I'm a journalist, but not a single professional historian has challenged a single fact that I described to you this afternoon, or that's in this book in the 5 years that it's been out. So the subtitle of the book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's not a hidden history. And I think as it becomes better known, there will be more support for the remedies that we need to implement. But simply intellectual support will not be enough. We need civil rights activists as well.
Next question. If schools are more segregated today, is Brown versus Board irrelevant?
Well, no, it's not irrelevant. Schools cannot be legally segregated. And if we still had a separate but equal doctrine that was considered legitimate in this country, the policies that I'm describing could not be implemented even with broader support. So I don't think the Brown versus Board of Education is irrelevant, but it wasn't effective in desegregating the schools in this country, because the reason the schools are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And so we need to desegregate neighborhoods before we can really achieve substantial school desegregation. We can achieve some. We can do it with attendance boundary zone changes in border areas, so that you can include both Black and white students in the same attendance zone. You can do it with magnet schools. You can do it with voluntary busing programs that exist in some places. I can describe some of these in a follow-up email. But you can't do much without desegregating neighborhoods.
Next question. Professor Derek Bell suggested that the white community acts on civil rights issues only when it thinks it's in their best interest to do so. How would you suggest that we convince the white community that it is in its best interest to remedy the inequalities you've suggested?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with Professor Bell on that. We accomplished a lot of civil rights victories in the 1960s, not because whites thought it was in their narrow self-interest to do so, but because we created an environment where it was impossible not to do so, with demonstrations, with marches, even with civil disobedience. I don't know what the tactics of a new civil rights movement will be, but I expect the same thing will be necessary. But I would go beyond and say that it is in the best self-interest of whites to participate in the civil rights movement to desegregate this society. as an industrialized country, we have a less adequate public sector than any other industrialized country. And whites suffer from that inadequate public sector. And one of the most important reasons why we have such an inadequate public sector is because some leaders have convinced whites that they shouldn't support programs that would benefit them because they would also benefit African Americans. It's a product of racial division. And if we remedied the unconstitutional segregation that we have, whites would benefit as well.
We have two questions that ask somewhat similar things, so let me put them both out there for you. The first one is, what other support do you envision for Black people who are provided opportunities to live in predominantly white neighborhoods? In particular, how do you address white flight and its real impact on property values and belonging? Black people who move into white neighborhoods face real violence. And then the second is, you mentioned as a possible remedy, affirmative action programs.
Well, can we take one at a time, because I'm not going to remember them both?
Okay, it was another white flight, but sure.
Oh, well, go ahead then. If it's the same question.
I think it's pretty similar. You mentioned as a possible remedy affirmative action programs in which the federal government could buy homes and resell them to African American home buyers at discounted interest rates. Wouldn't this still result in de facto segregation due to consistent and current patterns of white flight?
Well, you can have white flight only because there are white segregated places to flee to. And if we had systematic policies that challenged system-wide segregation, white flight would be minimized. But there are also policies that can be followed that prevent white flight. The poster child, actually, for those policies is in the Chicago metropolitan area. Oak Park has engaged for decades in an intentional policy program to prevent white flight, and it's been successful. It's a relatively desegregated community, not entirely perfectly. There's a concentration of African Americans on the border of Austin, a concentration of whites at the western edge of the community, but it's been fairly successful. A number of creative programs were used. One of the things they did, I don't think it's being done anymore because it's not necessary, is they created an insurance program. Even Chicago had such a program, insuring homeowners against declines in their property values. In order to relieve the biggest generated manufactured fear of whites from African Americans moving into their neighborhood. I think the programs are abandoned because they never paid out anything because property values never actually fell when African Americans moved into their neighborhoods. That's one policy. They organized real estate agents not to put up lawn signs that indicated that a neighborhood was flipping. They engaged in welcoming committees that brought people together and in greater understanding as they moved into the community. There are other examples of this as well. Mount Airy, a community in Philadelphia, had similar policies. Cleveland Heights, a suburb of Cleveland, had similarly. So we can, again, the policies are well known. What's missing is the intent to implement them.
So you talked to us about the new movement to redress segregation and gave some examples. Have any areas actually started to embark and adopt these actions?
Well, let me divide that into two parts. One is the specific new movement to redress racial segregation has not yet been launched. It's something that's being planned, and when they launch it, they will be placing organizers in communities to help to create these local civil rights groups. And as I said, after this program, I can give you a link where you can sign up to receive information about it when it's launched. But the other part of the question is there are many, many places in this country that have implemented programs that help to desegregate. They're small. They're not widespread enough. They're not powerful enough. But there are models everywhere. There are communities that have inclusionary zoning programs, for example, that require any development to include a share of units that are affordable not only to low income, but to moderate income families. There are communities that have modified their Section 8 programs on an experimental basis, as I said, that provide higher voucher amounts to families who move into higher opportunity communities, helping to desegregate those communities. There are some communities that have done a better job than others in placing low-income housing tax credit units in higher opportunity places. There are many places that have down payment assistance programs. They, of course, they're afraid of the Supreme Court, so they don't say they're for race, but they're for first-time home buyers who are disproportionately African American, and they're targeted for neighborhoods that are heavily African American. There are many, many communities that have those kinds of programs. So those so there are lots of models around to take advantage of and to copy. The ideas, as I say, are well known, and the implementation of those ideas has been tried. We know what works. We just haven't done much of it.
So what do you most hope to see from the Biden administration in terms of addressing segregation in American cities?
Not much. I think the Biden administration is well-intentioned, but I don't believe that the political environment exists to do much in the way of redressing segregation. And I hope that the political environment will change, and it will be possible to take actions. I'm sure the Biden administration, well, I'm not sure, but I believe that the Biden administration would like to do a lot more than it's politically possible to do. And we need to make it possible for them to do it. And it will probably not be in the Biden administration that becomes possible. It takes a while to build a civil rights movement, as it did in the 1950s and 60s. It didn't happen overnight.
Next question. How can students, faculty, and staff look into the history of their own communities to better understand the ways in which policies made it more or less segregated?
Well, how can you do it? You can do it. You can look into your histories. I don't know what more to say. You can become amateur historians. You can go and look into local newspapers, local community newspapers, and look at real estate ads of the 1940s and 50s and see the way in which subdivisions were advertised as being restricted, for example. You can look at the deeds of single-family homes in your community if they were constructed in the mid-early 20th century and find the deed clauses that prohibit resale to anything but Caucasians or rental to anything but Caucasians. Again, with the if the new movement to redress racial segregation gets launched in a community, I mean it will, but in a particular community, it will provide research support for people who want to investigate the history in their own communities.
What are some ideas that you have that can address the role that the institution of police has held in upholding segregation in neighborhoods?
Well, I don't have any ideas. I'm sure that you don't know. What we need to do is have community policing. We need to demilitarize the police. We obviously need to do a better job of enforcing prohibitions against discriminatory abuse. This is a problem that I'm sure you're all familiar with. As you know, or may know, the Obama administration had a series of consent decrees with local police departments. I think Chicago was one of them, actually, that designed to re-educate the police and monitor abusive practices. The Trump administration canceled those consent decrees, so we have to start from scratch again in doing this. But community policing is get police out of their cars and into communities. Monitor the extent to which profiling is used by police to enforce, for example, traffic violations, which may seem like a trivial thing, but it's a very abusive phenomenon that creates enormous distrust on the part of African Americans and the cities in which they live. These are all things that were covered in these consent decrees, and you should look at the Chicago consent decree, and you can see all the various policies that the Chicago Police Department were required to adopt under that decree.
Eliminating housing discrimination, although admirable and badly needed, has its challenges. For example, how do you extinguish a widespread and prevailing belief that allowing Blacks into white neighborhoods will reduce property values?
Well, as I said, it's unfounded in reality. Uh, you know, in the mid 20th century, when the government was promoting this belief as a justification for its exclusion from of African Americans from white neighborhoods, the government was well aware of research that showed that when African Americans move into white neighborhoods, property values increase; they don't decrease. And if you think about it, you'll see why. It's obvious. African Americans have a shorter supply relative to their demand of available housing. And so African Americans have always been willing to pay more for comparable housing than whites were willing to pay. And so if African Americans move into a white neighborhood, the chances are their homes are going to be the best maintained, the most invested in, because they are typically going to be wealthier than the whites who live in that particular neighborhood. The time when property values declined is when speculators and realtors try to create fear in those communities that property values would decline, and terrify whites that if they didn't leave quickly, they would lose the value of their homes. This was a practice known as blockbusting. And there's a wonderful book about Chicago called Family Properties by, oh, I'm sorry. I'll have to send this to you. Anyhow, Family Properties, you can look it up, by the daughter of a real estate agent who tried to stop this practice. But when in my book, I describe how a community, well, many communities, an African-American family moved in, property values increased. Speculators came into that community, tried to terrify white homeowners with tactics like hiring Black women to walk up and down the street with baby carriages, hiring Black men to drive up and down with in convertibles with radios blasting. One speculator bragged in a national magazine article that he organized burglaries to convince white families that their community was going to turn into a crime-ridden place. What happened was the African American, the white families then sold their homes to these speculators at a price lower than the market should have required. And the speculators then turned around and sold it to the Black families for more than the market required. But the decline in property values where it took place as a result of this blockbusting was entirely manufactured. If left to normal market forces, property values did not decline as a result of African Americans moving in. In fact, because of the existence of discrimination and the restricted supply, property values typically rose when African Americans moved into a neighborhood.
In your discussion of St. Louis, including Ferguson, you discussed the idea of private streets. How can we convince residents in urban areas not to utilize or expand these exclusionary practices in order to actually become part of their surrounding communities and provide continuous public ways?
Well, I think the answer is the same as I've given before. We need much more public education. And I don't mean schools for children, I mean public education of the public. And the only people who can do that is a new movement of activists who will engage in these kinds of practices.
As we've seen over the past few years, it's clear that data and evidence-based policies around race are not effective in convincing white people that they are voting against their own best interests because their emotional and potentially subconscious bias takes over. Are we then placing too much emphasis on data and evidence? Should we be making more emotional appeals to society? If so, how do you get that message across without villainizing activists due to the inevitable police response to protest and civil disobedience?
Well, you know, you can tell by looking at me, I'm an old man. I actually lived in Chicago during the early years of the civil rights movement. I saw things change. You know, one of the jobs I had, let me tell you this, one of the jobs I had when I was a young man, probably in the, I guess it was the mid 1960s, early 1960s, I worked for the Chicago Urban League as a researcher. And one of my jobs was to identify all of the supervisory policymaking positions in the corporate sector of Chicago. And in those days, there was no internet. You had these giant manuals, thick manuals that listed every corporation, and it listed the phone numbers if you wanted to get hold of the purchasing manager or the shipping and receiving director or the personnel director, as human resources were called in those days. And I counted up all of the policymaking supervisory positions in the corporate sector of Chicago. There were roughly 4,000 of them. How many do you think in Chicago in 1964? It probably was a city with about a 35% African American population. How many of those positions at the level of shipping and receiving director were occupied by an African American? Well, if I were there in person, I'd look around the room and you would take your guesses, but I'll have to tell you. The answer is zero. Zero. Not a single supervisory policymaking position in the city of Chicago and corporate sector in the mid 1960s was occupied by an African American. Well, I was a young man. I wasn't sophisticated, so I won't use myself as an example. But if you told my boss, the research director at that time, that in 10 years you couldn't have a corporation in Chicago without a diverse executive suite, he would have said you were crazy. But it did. We made enormous gains in the 1960s. It's hard, I know, for many of you to imagine what this country was like before we began to desegregate employment and public accommodations, public transportation in all parts of the country. But I've seen enormous change in my life, and it came about both by public education and by activism. And force activism forced people to confront facts that they hadn't previously confronted. Did the police behave politely towards demonstrators? No. And I don't expect that they would today. But that kind of activism is necessary in order to force the country to confront the segregation that we've created. And I'm hopeful that out of this very, very astounding discussion that we're having in this country now about racial inequality that we've never had before, I'm hopeful that there's a possibility that out of that discussion, a new movement of civil rights activists will emerge. If it doesn't, then you're right, we won't see any change.
Well, we are just about out of time. Do you have a final thought or two that you would like to share with the audience?
No, but I will be following up with you in an email that the Dean is going to distribute. I will give you information about how to get informed about this new movement to redress racial segregation. I'll also put links into some articles and other information that I referred to in my talk so that you can read more about it. I'm grateful for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us this evening, and thanks to the audience for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you.